Hello, Slumber Seekers, and welcome to the Slumber Tales podcast, where we read to you some of our favorite stories. My name is Finian Schwartz, and I'll be your storyteller tonight. If you have a favorite story that you'd like us to read, share it with us. You can leave a comment if that's available, or email us at myslumbertales@gmail.com. That's myslumbertales@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, let's jump into our story for tonight. Chapter 5. Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. Through her tears, Nanny Cook started toward the park. She could now see Mrs. Dearly, Nanny Butler, and the 3 dogs, who'd just turned for home. It seemed such a terrible and strange thing that they could be strolling along so happily, when every step brought them nearer to such dreadful news. As they came across the outer circle, Nanny Cook ran to meet them, crying so hard that Mrs. Dearly found it hard to understand what had happened. The dogs heard the words, puppies, saw Nanny Cook's tears, and rushed down to the area. Then they went dashing over the whole house, searching and searching. Every few minutes Mrs. and Perdita howled, and Pongo barked furiously. While the dogs searched and the nannies cried on each other's shoulder, Mrs. Dearly telephoned Mr. Dearly. He came home at once, bringing with him one of the top men from Scotland Yard. The top man found a bit of sacking on the area railings and said the puppies must have been dropped into sacks and driven away in the black van. He promised to comb the underworld, but warned the Dearlys that stolen dogs were seldom recovered, unless a reward was offered. A reward seemed an unreasonable thing to offer a thief, but Mr. Dearly was willing to offer it. He rushed to Fleet Street and had large advertisements put on the front of the evening papers. This was rather expensive, and arranged for even larger advertisements to be on the front pages of the next day's morning papers. This was even more expensive. Beyond this, there seemed nothing he or Mrs. Dearly could do, except try to comfort each other, and comfort the nannies, and the dogs. Soon the nannies stopped crying, and joined in the comforting, and prepared beautiful meals, which nobody felt like eating. And at last, night fell on the stricken household. Worn out, the 3 dogs lay in their baskets in front of the kitchen fire. "Think of my baby cat-pig in a sack," said Mrs. with a sob. "Her big brother Patch will take care of her," said Pongo soothingly, though he felt most unsoothed himself. "Lucky's so brave, he's gonna bite the thieves," wailed Perdita, "and then they're gonna kill him." "No, they won't," said Pongo. "The pups was stolen because they're valuable. No one will kill them. They're only valuable while they're alive." But even as he said this, a terrible suspicion was forming in his mind, and it grew and grew as the night wore on. Long after Mrs. and Perdita, utterly exhausted, had fallen asleep, he lay awake, staring at the fire, chewing the wicker of his basket as a man might have smoked a pipe. Anyone who did not know Pongo very well might have thought him handsome, amusing, and charming, but not particularly clever. Even the Dearlys did not quite realize the depths of his mind. He was often still so puppyish. He would run after balls and sticks, climb into laps far too small to hold him, roll over on his back to have his stomach scratched. How was anyone to guess that this playful creature owned one of the keenest brains in dogdom? It was at work now. All through the long December night, he put 2 and 2 together and made 4. Once or twice, he almost made 5. He had no intentions of alarming Mrs. and Perdita with his suspicions. Poor Pongo! He not only suffered on his own account as a father, he also suffered on the account of 2 mothers, for he had come to feel the puppies had two mothers, though he never felt he had two wives. He looked on Perdita as a much-loved younger sister. He would say nothing about his worst fears until he was quite sure. Meanwhile, there was an important task ahead of him. He was still planning it when the nannies came down to start another day. As a rule, this was a splendid time, with the fire freshly made, plenty of food around, and the puppies at their most playful. This morning, well, as Nanny Butler said, it just didn't bear thinking about. But she thought about it, and so did everyone else in that puppyless house. No good news came during the day, but the Dearlys were surprised and relieved to find that the dogs ate well. Pongo had been firm. "You girls have got to keep your strength up." And there was an even greater surprise in the afternoon. Pongo and Mrs. showed very plainly that they wanted to take the Dearlys for a walk. Perdita did not. She was determined to stay at home in case any pup returned and was in need of a wash. Cold weather had come at last. Christmas was only a week away. "Mrs. must wear her coat," said Mrs. Dearly. It was a beautiful blue coat with a white binding. Mrs. was very proud of it. Coats had been bought for Pongo and Perdita too, but Pongo had made it clear he disliked wearing his. So the coat was put on Mrs., and both dogs were dressed in their handsome chain collars. And then they put the Dearlys on their leashes and led them into the park. From the first, it was quite clear the dogs knew just where they wanted to go. Very firmly, they led the way right across the park, across the road, and to the open space, which is called Primrose Hill. This did not surprise the Dearlys, as it had always been a favorite walk. What did surprise them was the way Pongo and Mrs. behaved when they got to the top of the hill. They stood side by side, and they barked. They barked to the north, they barked to the south, they barked to the east and west, and each time they changed their positions, they began the barking with three very strange, short, sharp barks. "Anyone would think they were signaling," said Mr. Dearly. But he did not really mean it, and they were signaling. Many people must have noticed how dogs like to bark in the early evening. Indeed, twilight has sometimes been called dogs' barking time. Busy town dogs bark less than country dogs, but all dogs know all about the twilight barking. It is their way of keeping in touch with distant friends, passing on important news, enjoying a good gossip. But none of the dogs who answered Pongo and Mrs. expected to enjoy a gossip, for the three short, sharp barks meant help, help, help. No dog sends that signal unless the need is desperate, and no dog who hears it ever fails to respond. Within a few minutes, the news of the stolen puppies was traveling across England, and every dog who heard it at once turned detective. Dogs living in London's underworld, hard-bitten characters, also hard-biting, set out to explore sinister alleys where dog thieves lurk. Dogs in pet shops hastened to make quite sure all puppies offered for sale were not Dalmatians in disguise. And dogs who could do nothing else swiftly handed on the news, spreading it through London and on through the suburbs, and on to the open country. Help, help, help. 15 Dalmatian puppies stolen. Send news to Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park, London. End of message. Pongo and Mrs. hoped all this would be happening, but all they really knew was that they had made contact with the dogs near enough to answer them, and that those dogs would be standing by at twilight the next evening to relay any news that had come along. One Great Dane over toward Hampstead was particularly encouraging.
"I have a chain of friends all over England,"
he said in his great booming bark,
and I will be on duty day and night. Courage, courage, O dogs of Regent's Park.
It was almost dark now, and the Dearlys were suggesting, very gently, that they should be taken home. So after a few last words with the Great Dane, Pongo and Mrs. led the way down Primrose Hill. The dogs who had answered them were silent now, but the twilight barking was spreading in an ever-widening circle, and tonight it would not end with twilight. It would go on and on as the moon rose high over England. The next day, a great many people who had read Mr. Dearly's advertisements rang up to sympathize. Cruella de Vil did, and seemed most upset when she was told the puppies had been stolen while she was talking to Nanny Cook. But no one had anything helpful to say, and Scotland Yard was frankly baffled. So it was another sad, sad day for the Dearlys, the nannies, and the dogs. Just before dusk, Pongo and Mrs. again showed that they wished to take the Dearlys for a walk, so off they started, and again the dogs led the way to the top of Primrose Hill. And again they stood side by side and gave 3 sharp barks. But this time, though no human ear could have detected it, they were slightly different barks, and they meant not help, 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 but ready, ready, ready. The dogs who had collected news from all over London replied first. Reports had come in from the West End and the East End and south of the Thames, and all these reports were the same. Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park. No news of your puppies. Deepest regrets. End of message. Poor Mrs. She had hoped so much that her puppies were still in London. Pongo's secret suspicion had led him to pin his hopes to news from the country, and soon it was pouring in. Some of it relayed across London, but it was always the same. Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park. No news of your puppies. Deepest regrets. End of message. Again and again, Pongo and Mrs. barked the ready signal, each time with fresh hope. Again and again came bitter disappointment. At last, only the Great Dane over towards Hampstead remained to be heard from. They signalled to him, their last hope. Back came his booming bark.
Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park. No news of your puppies. Deepest regrets. End of...
The Great Dane stopped in mid-bark. A second later he barked again.
Wait, wait, wait!
Dead still, their hearts thumping, Pongo and Mrs. waited. They waited so long that Mr. Dearly put his hand on Pongo's head and said, "What about coming home, boy?" For the first time in his life, Pongo jerked his head from Mr. Dearly's hand, then went on standing stock still. And at last, the Great Dane spoke again, booming triumphantly through the gathering dusk.
Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo. News! News at last! Stand by to receive details!
A most wonderful thing had happened. Just as the Great Dane had been about to sign off, a Pomeranian with a piercing yap had got a message through to him. She had heard it from a poodle, who had heard it from a boxer, who had heard it from a Pekingese. Dogs of almost every known breed had helped to carry the news, and a great many dogs of unknown breed, none the worse for that, and all of them bright as buttons. In fact, 480 dogs had relayed the message, which had traveled over 60 miles, as the dog barks. Each dog had given the urgent signal, which had silenced all gossiping dogs. Not that many dogs were merely gossiping that night. Almost all the twilight barking had been about the missing puppies. This was the strange story that now came through to Pongo and Mrs. Some hours earlier, an elderly English sheepdog, living on a farm in a remote Suffolk village, had gone for an afternoon amble. He knew all about the missing puppies and had just been discussing them with the tabby cat at the farm. She was a great friend of his. Some little way from the village, on a lonely heath, was an old house completely surrounded by an unusually high wall. Two brothers named Sol and Jasper Baden lived there. They were merely caretakers for the real owner. The place had an evil reputation. No local dog would have dreamed of putting his nose inside the tall iron gates. In any case, these gates were always kept locked. It so happened that the sheepdog's walk took him past this house. He quickened his pace, having no wish to meet either of the Badens. And at that moment, something came sailing over the high wall. It was a bone, the sheepdog saw with pleasure. But not a bone with meat on it, he noted with disgust. It was an old, dry bone, and on it were some peculiar scratches. The scratches formed letters, and the letters were S-O-S. Someone was asking for help. Someone behind the tall wall and the high chained gates. The sheepdog barked a low, cautious bark. He was answered by a high, shrill bark. Then he heard a yelp, as if some dog had been cuffed. The sheepdog barked again, saying, "I'll do all I can." Then he picked up the bone in his teeth and raced back to the farm. Once home, he showed the bone to the tabby cat and asked her help. Then, together they hurried to the lonely house. At the back, they found a tree whose branches reached over the wall. The cat climbed the tree, went along its branches, and then leapt to a tree on the other side of the wall.
"Take care of yourself,"
barked the sheepdog.
"Remember, those Baden brothers are villains."
The cat clawed her way down, backwards, to the ground, then hurried through the overgrown shrubbery. Soon she came to an old brick wall, which enclosed a stable yard. From behind the wall came whimperings and snifflings. She leapt to the top of the wall and looked down. The next second, one of the Baden brothers saw her and threw a stone at her. She dodged it, jumped from the wall, and ran for her life. In 2 minutes, she was safely back with the sheepdog.
There, she said triumphantly. The place is seething with Dalmatian puppies.
The sheepdog was a formidable twilight barker. Tonight, with the most important news in dogdom to send out, he surpassed himself. And so the message traveled, by way of farm dogs and house dogs, great dogs and small dogs. Sometimes a bark would carry half a mile or more. Sometimes it would need only to carry a few yards. One sharp-eared cairn saved the chain from breaking by picking up a bark from nearly a mile away, and then almost bursting herself getting it to the dog next door. Across miles and miles of country, across miles and miles of suburbs, across a network of London streets, the chain held firm. From the depths of Suffolk to the top of Primrose Hill, where Pongo and Mrs., still as statues, stood listening. Puppies found in lonely house. SOS on old bone. Mrs. could not take it all in, but Pongo missed nothing. There were instructions for reaching the village, suggestions for the journey, offers of hospitality on the way, and the dog chain was standing by to take a message back to the pups. The sheepdog would bark it over the wall in the dead of night. At first, Mrs. was too excited to think of anything to say, but Pongo barked clearly. "Tell them we're coming. Tell them we start tonight. Tell them to be brave." Then Mrs. found her voice.
"Give them all our love. Tell Patch to take care of Cadpig. Tell Lucky not to be too daring. Tell Roly-Poly to keep out of mischief."
She would have sent a message to every one of the 15 pups if Pongo had not whispered, "That's enough, dear. We mustn't make it too complicated. Let the Great Dane start work now." So they signaled off, and there was a sudden silence. And then, though not quite so loudly, they heard the Great Dane again, but this time he was not barking toward them. What they heard was their message, starting on its way to Suffolk. Chapter 6. To the Rescue. As they walked the Dearlys home, Pongo said to Mrs. "Did you hear who owns the house where the puppies are imprisoned?"
Mrs. said, "No, Pongo, I'm afraid I missed many things the Great Dane barked."
"I will tell you everything later," said Pongo. He was faced with a problem. He now knew that his terrible suspicions were justified, and it was time Mrs. learned the truth. But if he told her before dinner, she might lose her appetite, and if he told her afterward, she might lose her dinner. So still he said nothing, and he made her eat every crumb of dinner, and then join him in asking for more, which the nannies gave with delight. "It may be a long time before we get another meal," he explained. While the nannies fed the Dearlys, the dogs made their plans. Perdita at once offered to come to Suffolk with them.
"But you are still much too delicate for the journey, dear Perdita," said Mrs. "Besides, what could you do?" "I could wash the puppies," said Perdita. But Pongo and Mrs. then said they knew Perdita was a beautiful puppy washer, but her job must be to comfort the Dearlys, and she felt that herself. "If only we could make them understand why we're leaving them," said Mrs. sadly.
"If we could do that, we shouldn't have to leave them," said Pongo. "They would drive us to Suffolk in their car, and send the police."
"Oh, let us have one more try to speak their language," said Mrs.
The Dearlys were sitting by the fire in the big white drawing room. They welcomed the two dogs and offered them the sofa, but Pongo and Mrs. had no wish for a comfortable nap. They stood together, looking imploringly at the Dearlys. Then Pongo barked gently,
"Woof, woof, woofuk."
Mr. Dearly patted him, but understood nothing. Then Mrs. tried,
"Woof, woof, woofuk. Are you telling us the puppies are in Suffolk?"
said Mrs. Dearly. The dogs wagged their tails wildly, but Mrs. Dearly was only joking. It was hopeless, and the dogs knew it always would be. Dogs can never speak the language of humans, and humans can never speak the language of dogs. But many dogs understand almost every word humans say, while humans seldom learn to recognize more than half a dozen barks, if that. And barks are only a small part of the dog language. A wagging tail can mean so many things. Humans know that it means a dog is pleased, but not what a dog is saying about his pleasedness. Really, it is very clever of humans to understand a wagging tail at all, as they have no tails of their own. Then there are the snufflings and snifflings, the pricking of ears, all meaning different things, and many, many words are expressed by a dog's eyes. It was with their eyes that Pongo and Mrs. spoke most that evening, for they knew that the Dearlys could at least understand one eye word. That word was love, and the dogs said it again and again, leaning their heads against the Dearlys' knees, and the Dearlys said, "Dear Pongo," and
"Dear Mrs."
again and again.
"They're asking us to find their puppies. I know they are,"
said Mrs. Dearly, never guessing that, as well as declaring their love, the dogs were saying, "We are going to find the puppies. Please forgive us for leaving you. Please have faith in our safe return." At 11 o'clock, the dogs gave Mrs. Dearly's hand one last kiss and took Mr. Dearly out for his last run. Perdita joined them for this. She had spent the evening with the nannies, feeling that Pongo and Mrs. might wish to be alone with their pets. Then all 3 dogs went to their baskets in the warm kitchen, and the house settled for the night. But it did not settle for long. Shortly before midnight, Pongo and Mrs. got up, ate some biscuits they had hidden, and took long drinks of water. Then they said a loving goodbye to Perdita, who was in tears, nosed open a window at the back of the house, and got out into the mews. They knew they could not open the gate at the top of the area steps. Carefully they nosed the window shut so that Perdita would not get a chill, and then went round to the area railings to give her one last smile. Dogs smile in various ways. Pongo and Mrs. smiled by wrinkling their noses. She was there at the kitchen window, bravely trying to wag her tail. Beyond Perdita, Mrs. could see the 3 cushioned baskets in the rosy glow from the fire. She thought of the many peaceful nights she had spent in hers, in the happy days when a dog could fall asleep looking forward to breakfast. Poor Mrs. Of course she loved Pongo, the puppies, the dearlies, and the nannies, and dear, kind Perdita, best of everything in the world. But she also loved her creature comforts. Never had her home seemed so dear to her as now when she was leaving it for a dangerous and unknown world. And it was such a cold world. The night was fine, the stars were brilliant, but the wind was keen. If only she could have brought her beautiful blue coat, now hanging on a peg in the warm kitchen. Pongo saw her shiver. It was a hard thing for a loving husband to see his wife shiver. "Are you cold, Mrs.?" he asked anxiously. "No, Pongo," said Mrs., still shivering. "I am," said Pongo, untruthfully, "but I shall soon warm up." He tail-wagged goodbye to Perdita, then started off briskly along the outer circle, looking very spirited. Mrs. kept pace with him, but after its last wag to Perdita, her tail went down. After a few minutes, Pongo said, "Are you warmer now, Mrs.?" "Yes, Pongo," said Mrs., still shivering, and still her tail was down. Pongo knew that if he could not cheer her up, she would never be able to face the hardships that lay ahead, and he thought he could do with some cheering up himself. So he began a little speech, intended to give them both courage. "I sometimes think," he said, "that you and I have become a bit pampered. Well, pampered does good dogs no harm, provided they don't come to depend on it. If they do, they become old before their time. We should never lose our liking for adventure. Never forget our wild ancestry." They were passing the zoo. "Oh, I know we are worried about the puppies, but the more we worry, the less we shall be able to help them. We must be brave. We must even be gay. We must know that we cannot fail. Are you warmer now, Mrs.?" "Yes, Pongo," said Mrs., but still she shivered, and still her tail drooped. They were now nearly at the bridge which leads from the outer circle toward Campden Down. "Stop for a moment," said Pongo, and he turned and looked back along the curve of the circle. No car was in sight, no light was in any window. The lamp-posts were like sentinels, guarding the sleeping park. "Think of the day when we come back with 15 puppies running behind us," said Pongo.
"Oh, Pongo, are you sure?"
"Absolutely sure," said Pongo. "Are you a little warmer now, dear Mrs.?"
"Yes, Pongo, and this time it's true."
"Then onwards to Suffolk," said Pongo. And as they ran toward the bridge, Mrs. carried her tail as high as his. "Not too high, Mrs. dear," said Pongo. "Let our hearts be gay, but not our tails." For when Dalmatians' tails curl over their backs, it's called a gay tail, and it's a bad fault. Mrs. was still laughing at this little joke when her heart gave a wild flutter. Coming toward them was a policeman. Instantly, Pongo led the way into a back street, and they were soon safely out of the policeman's sight. But seeing him had reminded Mrs. of something.
"Oh, Pongo! We are illegal! We're out without our collars!"
"And a good thing, too," said Pongo, "for a dog can be grabbed by a collar. But I do wish we could have brought our coat."
He had noticed that she was shivering again, though this time it was because she had been scared by the policeman.
"I don't,"
said Mrs. bravely.
"For if I wore a coat, how should I know how cold the puppies were? They have no coats. Oh, Pongo, how can they make the journey from Suffolk in such wintry weather? Suppose it snows?"
They may not have to make the journey yet. Mrs. stared in astonishment.
"But we must get them back quickly, or the dog thieves will sell them."
"Nothing will happen to them yet," said Pongo. And now he knew it was time to tell his wife the truth. "Let's rest a moment," he said, and led Mrs. into the shelter of a doorway. Then he went on gently. "Dear Mrs., our puppies were not stolen by ordinary dog thieves. No, try not to be too frightened. Remember, we are going to rescue them now. Our puppies were stolen by Cruella de Vil's orders, so that she can have their skins made into a fur coat. Oh, Mrs., be brave." Mrs. had collapsed. She lay on the doorstep, panting, her eyes full of horror. "But it will be all right, dear Mrs. They will be safe for months yet. They are much too small to be used for a fur coat yet." Mrs. shuddered. Then she struggled to her feet.
"I will go back," she cried. "I will go back and tear Cruella de Vil to pieces."
"That would do no good at all. We must rescue the puppies first, and think of our revenge later. On to Suffolk."
"On to Suffolk, then,"
said Mrs., staggering along on shaky legs.
"But we shall come back, Cruella de Vil."
Soon Mrs. began to feel better, for Pongo made her see that puppies whose skins were wanted for fur coats would be well fed and well taken care of and kept together. Ordinary dog thieves might have sold them already, and to different people. She asked many questions, and he told of his early suspicions. Now he had suddenly recalled the evening they had first seen Cruella, and sat under the piano in the red drawing-room. "She said we would make enchanting fur coats, Mrs."
"For spring wear over a black suit," said Mrs., remembering, "and she did take a lot of interest in the puppies."
"And she kept Nanny Cook talking while they were stolen," said Pongo. "But I wasn't quite sure until this evening, at the twilight barking. You didn't hear it as much as I did, Mrs. Our puppies are at Hell Hole, the ancestral home of the de Vils." And he knew, though he kept this from Mrs., that the SOS on the old bone meant save our skins. That's the end of our story for tonight. We hope you enjoyed. If you want to put your favorite story forward, our email is myslumbertales@gmail.com. Sleep tight.